All right. In the last video, you actually talked about what a watershed is or saw what a watershed is. In this video right here, we're going to go over some really important vocabulary terms that you're going to see in the next couple of videos in your exit ticket and in your mastery ticket later this week. So our last video introduced a watershed, which is an area of land where all the water flows into the same bodies of water. So this includes the streams, the lakes, the rivers. However, it also includes all of the land in that area. A lot of times I'll have students think that a watershed is just the parts or the bodies of water. That is not always true. Even like your backyard, your driveway, any piece of land is all part of a watershed. So all that means is that the water flows over that land, and any water that flows over that land is going to end up in the same area. So the highest points of elevation around an area are what's going to separate one watershed from another. There is no actual boundary drawn out or anything like that. It is just all based on the shape of the land. That is what a watershed is. We also are going to talk a lot about groundwater, and your next video is going to be very detailed about groundwater, why it's important to us, and how we actually affect it. All groundwater is water that has soaked into the ground. So this is water that we can't see. Any water that is on the surface of the ground, like a lake, a river, even a puddle, that would all be considered surface water. Groundwater has just soaked into the ground. If you've ever just poured out a cup of water onto dirt, you know that it soaks into it. It might not form a puddle. That would be groundwater. Now, that groundwater has to be stored up somewhere. And you can see in my last picture as well, there's these little spaces in between the rocks underneath the ground. Those spaces are called aquifers. Aquifers are where we store groundwater, and it's always in those little spaces between the rocks and soil underneath the ground. So in this picture here, where we have an aquifer in Florida, you can actually see that the water would soak into the ground and it would seep through all of these little spaces until finally it's just stored up in here. And as it goes through the ground, it actually gets filtered. All those rocks kind of take out particles and dirt. And when it gets to the bottom and is stored down there, it's actually very clean water. So if we need to, we can pump water from the aquifer in order to use it for drinking water or for other purposes. And that's actually where we get a very surprising amount of the water that you drink. You're going to see that in the video coming up soon. Runoff is the water that flows over the land when it rains. It carries anything on the land with it. So when it rains next time, I want you to pay attention to like flowing water that you normally wouldn't see if it was dry out. This is going to happen in a lot of places. You'll see it on streets especially, but even over land, like if you think about some of the activity time areas, whenever it would rain, you could see that dirt and things have been moved around. That's because of runoff flowing over that land. So whenever it rains, that groundwater is too saturated, meaning there's too much water and it won't soak in. So what it does instead is just flows over the land. That is called runoff. When it's dry and that groundwater has soaked into the soil, you won't see that runoff anymore. However, runoff is going to carry anything on the land with it. So that could be soil, that could be dirt, that could be pieces of plants, that could also be harmful chemicals. And those harmful chemicals we call contaminants. So contaminants are chemicals or pollution that gets into the water and lowers the quality. That is a process called contamination. So contaminants get into water through contamination. But there's some examples here. If you think about things that are in your driveway or in your yard or even on the roof, if it rains, that runoff is going to carry things like maybe fertilizer, maybe candy wrappers if you're throwing them outside. Maybe you washed your car and there's soap on your driveway. All of those things would be considered contaminants or pollution that can get into your water. So these are some things we're going to be going over in the next video. Here's a closer picture of that diagram that I showed you in the last two slides, but you can see that like oil or gasoline, anything from this plant here, if your dog goes to the bathroom outside on the yard and then it rains, those would all be considered contaminants that are going to be carried into your watershed through runoff. So in the next couple of slides, you have a chance to go back through this slideshow of vocabulary words, and you can take a second to read through them really carefully. And then you're going to actually do a matching game on your own to see how well you recognize these words and their definitions. After that, you'll watch your video on groundwater, and answer some questions that go along with it in your exit ticket.